52 BC. The siege of Avaricum, central Gaul. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had united numerous tribes in rebellion against Rome, watched from the fortress walls as a strange formation approached across the open ground. Roman soldiers had arranged themselves into a rectangular block, their shields held overhead and to the sides, creating what appeared to be a continuous shell of wood and bronze. The formation moved slowly but steadily toward the walls, looking from above like some enormous armored creature walking across the battlefield. Gallic archers lined the walls, their bows drawn, arrows ready. Vercingetorix had ordered them to concentrate fire on this approaching formation. Surely, under that volume of missiles, the Roman formation would break apart, and the soldiers would scatter for cover. The Gauls released their arrows. Hundreds of missiles arced through the air and fell on the Roman formation like deadly rain. The arrows struck the overlapping shields with sounds like hail on a roof. But the formation didn't break. It didn't slow. The Romans, underneath the shell of shields, continued advancing steadily, step by step, impervious to the arrow storm falling on them. More volleys followed. Thousands of arrows were expended. The ground around the formation bristled with shafts that had bounced off or fallen short. But the Testudo, the tortoise formation, continued its methodical advance, carrying the soldiers safely through missile fire that should have devastated an exposed unit. Vercingetorix had faced Roman infantry before. He knew legionaries were disciplined and well-armored, but this formation seemed to violate basic military logic. How could a compact formation of men with shields become effectively immune to arrows? How could soldiers advance while completely covered, unable to see where they were going, maintaining perfect coordination? How could they remain vulnerable men underneath shields and yet collectively become as invulnerable as if they wore stone armor? The tactical calculation that massed missile fire could stop an infantry advance, a calculation that had been valid for centuries, was being negated by a formation that seemed simple but proved devastatingly effective. What Vercingetorix and other enemies of Rome didn't understand about the Testudo was that it represented the ultimate expression of Roman military discipline and training. The formation wasn't just shields held together, it was a precisely coordinated drill that required extensive practice, absolute trust in comrades, physical strength to maintain position under missile impacts, and tactical training to move as a unit while unable to see clearly. The mathematics of defensive effectiveness were being written not in shield thickness or armor quality, but in the geometric arrangement that created overlapping protection with no gaps, in the training that allowed soldiers to maintain formation while blind to surroundings, in the coordination that moved the formation as a single organism, and in the discipline that kept soldiers locked in position despite arrows striking inches from their faces. The formation that looked like a simple trick was about to prove that Roman training could transform individual soldiers into collective invulnerability, and that when properly executed, the Testudo made Romans effectively immune to the missile fire that was supposed to be infantry's greatest vulnerability when advancing across open ground. The story of how the Testudo formation revolutionized siege warfare and infantry tactics begins with understanding both the specific mechanics of the formation and the broader tactical problems it solved. Ancient warfare, particularly siege operations, presented infantry with a fundamental vulnerability. Advancing across open ground toward fortifications meant exposure to missile fire from defenders. Arrows, javelins, stones, and other projectiles could inflict heavy casualties on troops crossing killing zones without cover. This reality shaped siege tactics for millennia. Attackers built siege towers and mantlets to provide overhead protection, dug approach trenches to minimize exposure, or accepted high casualties as the price of assault. The Roman testudo, Latin for tortoise, describing the shell-like appearance, was a formation that addressed this vulnerability through collective shield work rather than siege equipment. The basic principle was simple. Soldiers arranged their shields to create continuous overhead and side protection while maintaining mobility. The execution, however, required sophisticated coordination and extensive training that made the formation far more complex than it appeared. The formation itself had several variants depending on tactical situation and unit size. The most common configuration for a century, 80 men, during the imperial period, involved arranging soldiers in a rectangular formation approximately 8 to 10 men wide and 8 to 10 men deep. The soldiers in the front ranks held their shields, the rectangular scutum measuring approximately 4 feet tall by 2.5 feet wide, vertically in front of them, overlapping with adjacent soldiers to create a solid wall. The soldiers in the rear ranks held their shields horizontally overhead, again overlapping so that no gaps existed. The soldiers on the flanks angled their shields to protect the sides. The resulting formation was a box with all 6 sides protected by overlapping shields. The overlapping was crucial to effectiveness. Each shield overlapped with adjacent shields by several inches, meaning that even if arrows penetrated shield material partially, the overlapping sections caught projectiles before they could reach soldiers underneath. The shields in the overhead layer rested on the shoulders of soldiers below, distributing the weight so that soldiers in rear ranks supported the defensive structure while front ranks maintained forward-facing protection. The weight distribution was carefully managed. Each soldier supported part of the overhead protection while maintaining his own shield position. The scutum shield itself was engineered specifically to enable formations like Testudo. The shield was constructed from 3 layers of wooden strips, each layer oriented perpendicular to the adjacent layers, creating a laminated structure similar to plywood. This cross-grain construction gave the shield strength in all directions while keeping weight manageable. The wooden core was covered with canvas or leather and often reinforced with bronze or iron edges and a large iron or bronze boss in the center. The finished shield weighed approximately 20-22 pounds, heavy enough to provide protection but light enough that soldiers could hold it overhead for extended periods. The curvature of the scutum was designed to deflect impacts. The shield curved around the soldier's body in a semicircle, meaning projectiles struck at angles rather than perpendicular to the surface. This deflection turned direct impacts into glancing blows, reducing penetration and spreading impact force across the shield's surface. When multiple curved shields overlapped in testudo formation, the angles became more severe, making penetration even more difficult. The formation drill required to form and maintain testudo was complex and required extensive practice. Soldiers needed to coordinate their movements, maintain proper spacing, adjust shield positions continuously to ensure overlapping coverage, and move in unison while maintaining formation integrity. The training began with soldiers learning shield positions individually, then practicing in pairs to learn overlapping technique, then in small groups, and finally in full century strength. The drill was repeated until it became automatic. Soldiers could form testudo on command and maintain it under stress without conscious thought. The command structure during testudo operations was critical. The centurion commanding the century would be positioned where he could observe the overall formation but still maintain protection. He would call out movement commands, advance, halt, left, right, and the soldiers would respond in unison. Maintaining straight movement while blind to surroundings required soldiers to follow commands precisely and trust that adjacent soldiers were doing likewise. Any soldier breaking formation or failing to maintain proper position created a gap that could let arrows through. The physical demands were substantial. Holding a 20-pound shield overhead for extended periods caused arm and shoulder fatigue. The shield's absorbing arrow impacts transmitted shock through soldiers' arms. The formation itself was claustrophobic. Soldiers stood close together with limited visibility, shields pressing from all sides. Moving in formation required maintaining balance while supporting shield weight and coordinating steps with adjacent soldiers who were also moving blind. The combination of physical strength, endurance, and coordination required to maintain Testudo effectively was significant. The tactical situations where Testudo proved most valuable were siege approaches and operations under heavy missile fire. When Roman forces needed to advance across open ground toward fortified positions defended by archers, the Testudo allowed movement without prohibitive casualties. The formation transformed what should have been a killing zone into merely a physically demanding but survivable advance. This capability was strategically significant. It meant Romans could conduct siege operations that other armies couldn't attempt without accepting catastrophic losses. The siege of Avaricum in 52 BC during Caesar's Gallic Wars demonstrated Testudo effectiveness dramatically. The Gallic defenders had concentrated archers and slingers on the walls, creating interlocking fields of fire covering the approaches. Roman soldiers advancing in normal formation suffered significant casualties from the missile fire. Caesar ordered Testudo formation, and Roman centuries advanced steadily despite concentrated fire. The Gauls expended thousands of arrows with minimal effect. The overlapping shields caught or deflected virtually all missiles. Caesar's account, written in third person, but based on his direct observation, describes the Testudo advances. The soldiers formed Testudo and approached the walls, bringing up materials to fill the ditches. The Gauls on the walls threw down great stones and shot arrows continuously, but the formation of overlapping shields protected our men so that very few were wounded. The soldiers maintained their positions with great determination despite the weight of missiles striking their shields. The description captures both the effectiveness and the difficulty of the formation. The shields protected against missiles, but the physical experience of being underneath, while arrows struck continuously, was demanding. The psychological stress of maintaining formation while blind and while hearing arrows hitting shields around you required extraordinary discipline. Roman training had prepared soldiers for exactly this, the ability to maintain formation and continue mission regardless of stress. The siege of Uxellodunum, later in the Gallic Wars, provided another demonstration. Gallic defenders occupied a hilltop fortress with steep approaches. Roman forces needed to construct siege works while under fire from above, the worst possible situation for exposed troops. Caesar ordered Testudo formations for all work parties. The soldiers advanced up slopes, bringing materials and tools, working on siege constructions, all while maintaining Testudo protection. The Gauls fired continuously, but couldn't stop the Roman progress. The Testudo allowed Romans to conduct siege engineering under fire that would have made such work impossible without the formation. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC against the Parthians demonstrated Testudo, limitations as well as strengths. The Parthian army consisted primarily of horse archers who could shoot powerful composite bows from horseback. Roman forces under Crassus formed Testudo repeatedly when under heavy arrow fire. The formation provided protection against most arrows. Parthian arrows that would have killed unprotected soldiers were stopped by the overlapping shields or failed to penetrate deeply enough to cause serious wounds. However, the Parthians also fielded cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry with long lances who could charge the Testudo formations. The Testudo was immobile and couldn't effectively defend against cavalry charge. The Romans faced a tactical dilemma. Maintaining Testudo protected against arrows, but made them vulnerable to cataphracts, while opening formation to defend against cavalry exposed them to arrow fire. The Parthians exploited this by alternating. Archers would force Romans into Testudo, then cataphracts would charge, forcing Romans to break formation, then archers would resume fire. The Romans at Carrhae suffered catastrophic defeat, but the Testudo itself worked as designed. It protected against arrows effectively, but couldn't solve all tactical problems. The siege of Masada, decades later, showed Testudo use in the ultimate siege situation. Roman forces building the massive ramp up to the fortress conducted all work under potential fire from defenders above. Work parties formed Testudo when approaching the ramp construction site, maintained protection while working, and withdrew under Testudo when relieved. The formation allowed continuous construction operations despite the defenders' elevated position, providing ideal angles for missile fire downward onto Roman positions. The Jewish defenders at Masada attempted various methods to defeat the Testudo formations. They dropped large stones from the walls, hoping the mass and velocity would break through shields. Some stones did damage shields or break through when they struck directly, but the overlapping protection meant even broken shields often still provided protection from their neighbors' shields. The defenders shot fire arrows, attempting to set shields alight. The shield's leather covering was sometimes treated with vinegar or water to resist ignition, and soldiers would quickly extinguish any shields that did catch fire. The most effective counter the Masada defenders found was dropping heavy timbers or logs that would strike multiple shields simultaneously, potentially breaking through the formation or, at minimum, causing injuries from the distributed impact. But even this required lucky hits, and the Testudo remained effective enough that Roman work parties could operate despite being directly under the fortress walls, normally the most dangerous position in any siege. The later Roman Empire saw Testudo continue, but with some modifications as equipment and tactics evolved. The rectangular scutum was gradually replaced in some units, with oval shields that were lighter and easier to handle but less ideal for tight formations. The Testudo remained in tactical doctrine, but was used more selectively as Roman forces faced different enemies and different tactical situations. Against Germanic tribes who relied more on close combat than missile fire, Testudo was less necessary. Against Sassanid Persians, who used powerful composite bows, Testudo remained essential for operations under fire. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire's continuation, maintained Testudo in their tactical manuals for centuries. Byzantine military treatises from the 6th to 10th centuries AD describe Testudo formation and drill, indicating the formation remained part of military training 600–800 years after its development during the Republic. The longevity testifies to the formation's continuing utility in siege warfare and against missile-armed enemies. The specific advantages Testudo provided were multiple and compound. First, the formation created protection far exceeding what individual shields provided. A soldier holding his shield normally protected only himself and was vulnerable from multiple angles. In Testudo, every soldier was protected by multiple overlapping shields from multiple directions. The collective protection was geometrically greater than individual protection. Second, the formation allowed movement under fire that would otherwise be impossible. Soldiers crossing open ground under missile fire normally scattered, ran, or took heavy casualties. The Testudo allowed slow but steady advance that was predictable and controllable. Commanders could direct Testudo movements, knowing the formation would arrive at designated positions intact. Third, the formation provided psychological protection as significant as physical protection. Soldiers knew they were protected, that their comrades surrounded them, that the formation had been proven effective. This confidence allowed them to advance toward terrifying situations, walking toward walls bristling with archers, climbing slopes under fire from above. That would normally break morale. The psychological strength came from training, from trust in comrades maintaining their positions, and from experience proving the formation worked. Fourth, the formation demonstrated Roman military sophistication to enemies. When opponents saw Testudo advancing despite everything thrown at it, they recognized they faced an army with training and discipline far exceeding normal standards. The psychological impact on enemy morale was significant. How could you stop an enemy who could simply ignore your best defensive weapons? The training requirements that enabled Testudo effectiveness revealed Roman military culture's emphasis on drill and discipline. Other ancient armies had well-trained units, but few had the systematic training infrastructure Rome maintained. Legionaries practiced Testudo formation regularly throughout their service. The drill was part of standard training that every soldier learned, not a specialized technique reserved for elite units. This meant any Roman century could form Testudo on command, giving Roman forces tactical flexibility that enemies couldn't match. The centurions, who commanded centuries, were responsible for maintaining formation discipline and drill proficiency. A good centurion ensured his men practiced Testudo regularly, corrected formation errors, and maintained the training intensity necessary to execute the formation under combat stress. The centurion's role in maintaining tactical excellence was crucial to Roman military effectiveness broadly, and to Testudo specifically. The physical conditioning required to execute Testudo effectively was part of broader Roman military training. Legionaries conditioned their arms and shoulders through weapons drill, shield drill, and carrying loaded marches. The strength to hold shields overhead while advancing, to maintain position while shields absorbed impacts, to stay in formation for extended periods, all this required conditioning that Roman training provided systematically. The tactical coordination within Testudo demonstrated the sophistication of Roman military organization. The century operating in Testudo was a single organism with 80 parts working in perfect synchronization. Each soldier maintained his position relative to all adjacent soldiers, adjusted his shield continuously to maintain overlapping coverage, moved in response to commands, and compensated for any irregularities in terrain or formation. This level of coordination was possible only through extensive training with the same comrades. The century trained together, fought together, and developed the unit cohesion necessary to execute complex formations under stress. The engineering aspects of Testudo reflected Roman systematic approach to military problems. The formation was an engineered solution to the tactical problem of advancing under missile fire. The shield design, formation geometry, training drill, and command structure were all integrated components of a system designed to achieve specific capability. This engineering mentality, analyzing problems systematically and developing integrated solutions, characterized Roman military thinking broadly. The limitations of Testudo were also well understood by Roman commanders. The formation was slow. Advance speed was perhaps 1/3 of normal march pace. The formation was vulnerable to close combat. Soldiers in Testudo couldn't effectively fight hand-to-hand while maintaining shield coverage. The formation required relatively flat ground. Steep slopes or rough terrain made maintaining proper shield overlap difficult. The formation caused fatigue. Soldiers couldn't maintain Testudo indefinitely without rest. Roman tactical doctrine therefore used testudo selectively for specific situations where its advantages outweighed limitations. The formation was employed when crossing open ground, under fire, when approaching fortified positions defended by archers, when conducting engineering work under enemy observation, or when withdrawal under fire was necessary. In other tactical situations, normal formations were more effective. The counter-tactics enemies developed against Testudo revealed both the formation's strengths and exploitable weaknesses. The most effective counter was combined arms, using missile fire to force Testudo formation, then attacking with cavalry or infantry to exploit the formation's immobility and close combat vulnerability. The Parthians at Carrhae executed this effectively. Other counters included heavy projectiles that could break through shields, fire that could burn shields, or attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to find gaps in coverage. But these counters required capabilities not all armies possessed. Coordinating combined arms effectively required training and command structure many armies lacked. Heavy siege equipment was expensive and not available to many defenders. Most enemies facing Testudo simply couldn't stop it effectively. They would expend enormous quantities of arrows with minimal result while Romans advanced steadily and accomplished their objectives. The psychological impact of Testudo on both sides was significant and often underestimated. For Romans, the formation provided confidence to advance into situations that would normally inspire terror. Walking toward walls manned by hundreds of archers, climbing slopes under plunging fire, working within arrow range of fortifications, these situations should have been terrifying. But the Testudo made them merely physically demanding. The shields overhead and around provided tangible protection that allowed soldiers to function despite the psychological stress. For enemies, watching Testudo advance despite massive missile fire was demoralizing. Defenders would expend arrows by the thousands with no visible effect. The formation would continue advancing regardless of how much was thrown at it. This created the impression of invincibility, of facing an enemy who simply could not be stopped by conventional means. The psychological effect contributed to Roman tactical success as much as the physical protection. The cultural meaning of Testudo extended beyond its tactical utility. The formation became symbolic of Roman military discipline and collective strength. The image of soldiers maintaining perfect formation while under fire, protecting each other through coordinated action, advancing steadily toward objectives despite all obstacles, this embodied Roman military values of discipline, trust, and collective action over individual heroism. The Testudo represented Romanness in military form. The formation also represented Roman systematic approach to problems. Rather than accepting that advancing under fire meant casualties, Romans engineered a solution. Rather than improvising protection ad hoc, they developed a standardized drill practiced until perfect. Rather than relying on individual soldiers to protect themselves, they created a system where collective action provided protection impossible individually. This methodical, engineered approach to warfare characterized Roman military thinking throughout their history. The legacy of Testudo extended long past Rome's collapse. Medieval military theorists studied Roman formations, though the Testudo itself wasn't replicated exactly due to different shield types and tactical situations. The principle that coordinated shields could create collective protection exceeding individual protection influenced shield wall formations throughout medieval warfare. The Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, and other peoples developed shield wall tactics that owed conceptual debt to Roman models, including Testudo. The Testudo remained in military consciousness as an example of what drill and discipline could accomplish. Military academies for centuries used Testudo as case study in unit cohesion and collective action. The image of the tortoise formation advancing slowly but inexorably under arrow storms became metaphor for determination and systematic progress despite opposition. Modern military analysis of Testudo emphasizes the training intensity required. Military historians estimate that achieving Testudo proficiency required months of regular practice for recruit soldiers and continuous maintenance training for veteran units. The investment in training paid dividends in tactical capability that enemies couldn't match. This validated Roman training philosophy that intensive drill created capabilities worth the investment. The formation also demonstrated the compound effects of good equipment, systematic training, and tactical doctrine working together. The Testudo required specific shield design. Shields needed to be large enough to overlap, strong enough to withstand impacts, light enough to hold overhead, and shaped to deflect missiles. It required training drill that taught coordination and maintained it under stress. It required tactical doctrine that identified appropriate uses and integrated the formation into overall operations. All three components were necessary. Without proper shields, training couldn't produce effective Testudo. Without training, shields alone provided only individual protection. Without doctrine, the capability wouldn't be employed effectively. The Testudo exemplified Roman military excellence not because it was sophisticated technology. The shields were wood and bronze, the formation was geometric arrangement, but because it represented the integration of equipment, training, discipline, and doctrine into tactical capability that worked consistently and reliably. Enemies could see the formation, understand the principle, and still couldn't replicate it because they lacked the systematic training infrastructure and military culture that made Testudo possible. The mathematics weren't written in shield thickness or armor strength. They were written in geometric overlap that created protection exceeding component strength, in coordination precision that maintained formation under stress, in training intensity that made complex drill automatic, and in discipline that kept soldiers functioning while blind and while missiles struck inches away. The enemies who dismissed Testudo as simple shield trick learned that simplicity in appearance often masked sophistication in execution, that what looked like soldiers hiding under shields was actually a precisely engineered formation requiring months of training to execute properly, and that Roman military power came not from superior individual soldiers, but from systematic training that transformed individual soldiers into collectively superior formations. The arrow storms that should have stopped Roman advances proved ineffective against formations that distributed protection collectively against soldiers trained to maintain position despite impacts, against commanders who understood exactly when and how to employ the formation for maximum advantage. The Testudo that looked from above like a strange armored creature walking across the battlefield was actually the ultimate expression of Roman military culture, disciplined, trained, systematic, collective, and devastatingly effective at solving the tactical problem of advancing under fire that had plagued armies for centuries before Rome engineered a solution that simply worked.